Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Real Estate Realities with the Rebel Broker. My name's Robert Whitelaw, and I am the Rebel Broker, licensed real estate broker in the state of California, member of the National Association of Realtors. But please, don't hold that against me. Today, I wanted to hit some of the politics that we've been wading through over the last month. Obviously, we've been through a very stressful election. Of course, a lot of people are focused on what's going to happen with some of the national part of that, but I'm more focused right now on propositions in California that would directly affect folks interested in real estate. There were several on the ballot, and while there's good news, there's also reason for concern, and I have had quite a few listeners reach out to me specifically asking what I feel the long-term effects of some of these are going to be. We really need to keep an eye on this. As folks who live in California, I realize a whole bunch of you don't. I have tons of listeners outside of the state of California. I have a ton of listeners who are not only outside of the state of California, but used to be in the state of California. I've seen a huge number of people leave over the last It's been an increasing number over the last 3 years. The last 2 years have seen an amazing increase in the number of people who, when I'm selling their property, they're not moving somewhere else in California. They're moving out of California entirely. And a lot of the reasoning behind why they're leaving relates to some of these issues that have been put on the ballot in 2020. So let's go ahead and jump in and take a look at a few of them. First on our list is California Proposition 15. Now, I did a show specifically on Prop 15, saying it was a horrible idea, a dumpster fire of an idea, and there were two arguments for it. First, even if you agreed with it, the timing is horrible. I think a lot of people, judging by the responses I got from listeners, agree with that. But what's really concerning is how it won or how it was defeated. But let's get into this for a second. Basically what this did, now for those of you who don't know, we have a thing called Prop 13, which was passed in the 70s, which limits property taxes to 1%, which included, your family home and that commercial building downtown. And I'm not real sure about the logic of why one should not be included and the other should. The bottom line is, by increasing the costs of ownership for a normal person through taxes, you make it that much more difficult for that person to own a home because they simply can't sustain the taxes relating to it because of the crazy values that we end up seeing attached to California real estate. But that same logic applies to someone who decides to buy the commercial building that they're going to have their business in. If they get assessed at a much higher rate, that doesn't mean we've suddenly stuck it to the man. That means we have simply increased the operating costs for a company, and no company, no person who's doing business on the side, let's say you've got a side hustle, if your costs get increased, that doesn't reflect zero action on your part. It either means you make do with less, and if you can't make do with less, that means you have to find another job or you have to get yourself a side hustle to make up the difference. People don't operate in a vacuum. So when your expenses increase, you typically react to it. In fact, you could probably make the argument that the folks who don't react to changes in their income or what their debts are the ones who end up in the most trouble when bad things happen. So I came down on the idea that no matter where we are in history, in terms of things we're trying to recover from, that this was just a bad idea for a number of reasons. One, it's misguided. It represents not just an increase to the cost of someone who holds commercial real estate, but it also reflects this ignorance of how these things tend to flow through an economy. But the reality is, if you've got a supermarket that owns the real estate that it occupies, or even doesn't, right? Because remember, somebody owns that. The reality is that either their direct holding costs of that property are going to go up through taxes, or their lease for that space is going to go up from taxes, because whoever does own that building isn't going to just eat that cost. When your costs go up, you don't tend to just eat them. You tend to pass those expenses onto your consumers. And in this case, the business is the consumer because they're either leasing that space or they're occupying it as their property that they own. So bad news all the way around. This wasn't something that was going to get paid for by companies. It was through an additional layer going to get paid for by us. When you go and buy your eggs, when you buy your bread, or for that gas station on the corner that suddenly has an increase in its costs, they're not going to just eat that. They're going to pass that on to you by increasing how much you pay for what they're selling you. So just a fundamentally flawed law that kind of is in ignorance of how things work in the world in a business sense and the kind of decisions that people make, assuming that by increasing taxes, there would be no response on the part of the people that get taxed. And you can see that that just doesn't happen. What concerns me the most about this, the great news is it was defeated. It did not pass. So commercial property is not going to be taxed differently. They're going to benefit from the same Prop 13 benefits that they have since the 70s. What's concerning is the margin of how it won. No was 51.8% and yes was 48.2%. Now, one thing that really concerns me is what percentage of the folks who voted do you think believe this is a good idea, but just believe the timing is wrong? I would bet that it's at least 2%. A lot of folks that I've talked to would guess that it's more like 5%, because I'll tell you what, I've talked to people who thought that this proposition was a great idea, just not timed well. So I can't take my anecdotal experience and translate it to the entire state, but I find it interesting that it only was defeated by this very narrow margin. And I know a lot of people I'm talking to, who I talk to, who have businesses, are equally concerned because there's a very good chance this will come up again. And just as another warning to other folks who live in California, if you believe that this is not a first step towards at least skewing how these property taxes work for everyone, not just commercial, but also for residential, I think you're making a mistake. They are definitely at some point, and this was one of the calls I made in a previous show, that because of all these various things that the state of California still wants to pay for without cutting other things, right? They don't want to prioritize and take the lowest priority things and get rid of them and then apply that to what they feel are more important things. They want to simply get more money to do these additional things. And we saw some propositions that were suggested here that were designed to also meet that goal of California state to bring in more money to be able to provide additional services that could potentially be trillions and trillions of dollars. So, as I said, for Proposition 15 to change the commercial property tax, that failed, but by a margin that has a lot of folks concerned, because in a future election, I have no doubt that something like this or the exact same thing will be proposed again. What happens if we're past COVID, we're past these concerns, and this comes up? Would it pass under those circumstances? And I've talked to an awful lot of folks who believe that it would, and I'm also concerned that it would. Not because I think that commercial properties should or shouldn't pay more money, but because I, as a consumer, I don't want my cost to go up, and this will make my costs for everything go up, because everything I buy stuff from occupies commercial space. And if their costs go up, my costs go up. This could depress the opening of new businesses. If the rents are too high, it would limit their ability to expand. Those are funds they have to spend now on infrastructure rather than headcount. So it suppresses everything. It suppresses hiring of new people. It suppresses reasonable costs for what these folks sell. It all around, it's a bad thing. So California Proposition 19 was to change property tax rules. And what this basically did was it allowed homeowners over 55, disabled, or wildfire disaster victims to transfer primary residence tax base to a replacement residence. It changes the taxation of family property transfers and establishes fire protection services funds. This passed. Now, for residents, I'm all for things that give you more abilities to make beneficial tax decisions for yourself. This one, again, passed by a relatively narrow margin, with only 51.1% saying yes and 48.9% saying no. What's kind of interesting is that is almost the exact same vote breakdown as we saw for Proposition 15. So I think that's kind of interesting to see that shift that is so similar. Now, next on our list of propositions that were voted on in 2020 here in California is Proposition 21. Local government rent control is the title of this particular law, and it would allow local governments to establish rent control on residential properties over 15 years old. So based entirely on age, which is bizarre. I'm not real sure why this made any sense. Rent control is generally identified as ineffective. If you go and you look at the statistics, if you look at the goals that people are trying to achieve with rent control properties, you tend to discover that it doesn't really help. So, background on rent control, if you want to go ahead and Google that, rent control has typically been a failure where it has been done, but it lets government exercise a certain level of control that they seem to enjoy, so they perpetuate it. What we saw here was a bigger margin of folks who voted against it, which is comforting. We had 59.7% of those who voted voting no, and only 40.3% voting yes. That's a strong enough impeachment of this idea that I don't think folks who are investors in California, who are landlords in California, need to worry a whole lot about that right now. I don't see it. This is something they'll definitely try again. Rent control seems to be a super desirable topic for an awful lot of folks in state government. But given the level of rejection that was laid on this, I don't think we're going to see that being an issue in the foreseeable future. Will it come up again? Probably, but they'll probably wait beyond the next election cycle, beyond the next proposition cycle, in order to reintroduce something similar. So in terms of propositions that were voted on in 2020 in California, that really covers the items that were real estate specific. We had a few in there that were concerning. The good news is they all went the direction I think anyone would want them to go who's a proponent of property rights. If you own property, you should have the highest level of freedom possible to do what you wish with your property. But it also was addressing items relating to taxation that would have been very oppressive in a time where we'd prefer more jobs, lower costs of living in terms of the commercial property tax. That one would have had such a far-reaching effect on so many people, on basically everyone, that I'm glad to see it was defeated. But unfortunately, it wasn't defeated by the margin I would have liked. So what's the takeaway? If you're a buyer, seller, or investor in California, I don't think anything happened in this election that should make you concerned, other than the idea that commercial property taxes might just go up. The reason I bring it up is because I feel that if we find ourselves not in a COVID lockdown scenario where people believe that this is where the timing is wrong, and that's the only thing that's wrong with this, in a future election cycle, we could see this introduced. And I don't think they wait several cycles. I think the very next opportunity they have to make this proposition votable again, they will. So that's a concern. So that's something I think folks in the commercial space and folks who are generally concerned about cost of living in California should be aware of. So for now, until the next election cycle in California, I think all of those folks who are looking to buy, sell, or invest in real estate are in a pretty good position. The things we would like to see not pass did not pass. And again, the only thing I'd call out would be the commercial real estate. So maybe a cautionary moment for folks who are in the commercial real estate space or folks looking to start a business, that it wouldn't surprise me that in the next cycle where we have propositions on the ballot, that there will be another attempt at this if we have brought ourselves out of the very bad timing of COVID and quarantine policies. All right, folks, thank you very much for taking the time to listen to what I have to say on these subjects. As always, the goal here is to give you more information than we take up in your time. Hope we've achieved that today. If you have any questions, concerns, or topics you'd like me to cover in a future show, feel free to reach out. You can find me at www.soldbyrobert.com.